We come now to our last episode on 1 Kings. Ahab is dead and the book is about to end. Hi, I'm Ken Godevinus, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thanks for joining us as we study 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 37 to 53. Let's hit some of the highlights of this passage. After they buried King Ahab in Samaria, they had to wash the chariot he was slain in by the pool of Samaria. The text adds that this was the place where the harlots of the city bathed themselves. In fact, the NAT translates the text as the place where the dogs licked his blood while prostitutes bathe. Others say the dogs licked the water in which the chariot was washed and the blood had been mixed in it. And if we check back to 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 19, we'll see this is exactly what God had predicted would happen. We should mention that to help us further formulate our thoughts on Ahab, the author reminds us again of the luxurious palace he had built, about which we could read further up on in the annals of the kings of Israel. Now, it would be worth one's time to look up the meaning of this phrase, the annals of the kings of Israel. It refers to all the auxiliary records that are normally kept by a king's staff or later on by various governments. They're not necessarily to be confused with the books of Chronicles in the Old Testament. In addition, Chuck Smith adds some very interesting facts from an archaeological perspective. He writes, quote, "In the city of Megiddo, which is one of the cities that Ahab had rebuilt, there are about 20 different levels of cities that had been built over earlier cities. This place has been the site of many ancient battles, and now in the level that dates to Ahab's time, next to the temple of Baal, the ruins of the temple of Baal that Ahab built, they found several hundred jars with the skeletons of babies that had been sacrificed by their parents to Baal worship." This reminds me of the mass grave sites that there has been great controversy about in Canada, about First Nations children that had been sent away to schools run by whites, and they tried to take everything of their Indian culture away from them and turn them into whites. And of course, there's great controversy about that, but the idea that children were sacrificed to Baal is something beyond my understanding. We understand from this, though, that there was good reason for God to want this horrible religious system to be utterly wiped out, because it did involve the sacrifice, the human sacrifice of their own babies under the worship of their God. The first section of this passage ends by telling us that Ahab's son, Ahaziah, became king of Israel in his place. And then we switch locales to Judah, where Jehoshaphat reigned. We are told that he was only 35 when he became king, and that he became king in the south during Ahab's 4th year of reign as king of the north. Jehoshaphat reigned for 25 years in Jerusalem. And then again, for some reason, the text gives us the name of his mother, Azubah, and tells us she was the daughter of Silhi. I suppose when a child turns out well, we're to give credit to both his parents, and I fully agree with that. This section ends by telling us that he ruled well, like his father Asa did, doing right in God's sight, but nevertheless, he did not have the courage to take away the high worship places, and many still sacrificed and burnt incense on them. We'll get back to that in a moment. Finally, as we saw in previous studies, he also made peace with the king of Israel. The next section, verses 45 to 50, informs us that Jehoshaphat also expelled the remnant of the Sodomites from the land. This is the good king. The Hebrew text translates this as burned away the Sodomites. But one other possible meaning is swept away the Sodomites. These Sodomites referred to here were male cult prostitutes practicing things that were not pleasing to God, that somehow had survived his father Asa's reign. They were still around. Verse 47 tells us that at that time there was no king in Edom, only a deputy king or governor, and thus perhaps these folks were still under the ultimate rule of Judah. Commentator Clark tells us that we're told this about Edom not having a king in order to account for Jehoshaphat's building ships at Ezion-Geber to go and get some of the gold that was up there. This was in the territory of the Edomites, and this showed them to be at that time under the Jewish yoke, perhaps. However, this attempt of Jehoshaphat's was without success, as the ships were broken apart by the waters or shipwrecked. In fact, Ahab's son in the north, Ahaziah, now the king up there, offered to have his men go with Jehoshaphat's men in ships to get the gold. But we're told here that the latter said thanks, but no thanks. We'll come back to that as well in a moment. Hold that thought. Now, it seems to his credit that he had learned his lesson of not entering a partnership with the ungodly. But when exactly did he do that? Again, we'll come back to that. Now, although once again we learned something different, and here it is, we're coming back to it right now. In 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 35 to 37, there we read, it tells us more about this shipping venture with Israel. It tells us that Jehoshaphat did in fact make an alliance with Ahaziah, and it ended in disaster. Maybe this was the first thing that he did, was enter this alliance, and the ships got shipwrecked. The Lord told Jehoshaphat why. Because you have allied yourself with Ahaziah, the Lord has destroyed your works, perhaps meaning the ships. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 37. Now, is the Bible contradicting itself? 2 Chronicles 20, and then what we have here in 1 Kings 22. My answer is no. It was after this word of the Lord that Jehoshaphat turned down the offer, or the continued offer, of a continued alliance with King Ahaziah of Israel. So once again, a simple clarification to clear up any confusion. Verse 50 tells us Jehoshaphat died and was buried in the city of his father David, allowing his son Jehoram, Jehoram, to become king of Judah. The last section, verses 51 to 53, tells us Ahab's son Ahaziah had become king during Jehoshaphat's 17th year of reign. So you can see the overlapping here. But Ahaziah only reigned for 2 years. He was an evil one in God's sight, as his father was and as his mother was. He served and worshipped Baal, provoking God to anger by actively or passively, encouraging the people to sin against God. And thus ends 1 Kings. Now, we cannot miss the fact that the word spoken through the prophet Micaiah earlier on was proven to be of God. Ahab never returned home alive. Astute students of the Bible with great memories may raise the point about there being some conflict on whether or not Jehoshaphat took down the high places. In 2 Chronicles 17:6, it is expressly said that he did take away the high places, contrary to what 1 Kings chapter 22 says. Again, is this an error in the scriptures? I don't think so. And here commentator Clark helps us out when he writes the following. Allowing that the text is right in 2 Chronicles, the two places may be easily recognized. There were two kinds of high places in the land. One, those used for idolatrous purposes. Two, those that were consecrated to God and were used before the temple was built. The former he did take away. The latter he did not. End of quote. So in summary, the book of 1 Kings ends on a low note. It begins with the promise of the twilight of Israel's greatest king, David. It ends with the sad reign of one of the most wicked kings over one of the kingdoms coming from the divided tribes of Israel. Matthew Henry concludes his comments on 1 Kings with these words, and I quote, "Miserable are the children that not only derive a stock of corruption from the parents, but are thus taught by them to trade with it. And unhappy, most unhappy parents are those that help to damn their children's souls." End of quote. Friends, it's been my prayer that as we study this book of 1 Kings together, we not only learn more about our faith's history, but we learn more about God and how He hates sin and deals with it. And finally, I hope each of us learn more about ourselves. I also hope these lessons will guide us as we live in a society that is, for the most part, as idolatrous and evil as the one Israel's kings lived in, if not more so. I'm hoping next to embark on a study of 2 Kings. We'll see how that goes. We'll continue to post our studies of that on this YouTube channel, Digging for Scriptural Gems. I hope you are already subscribed. And the next study will be under the playlist labeled 2 Kings or 2 Kings. Join us for that. In the meantime, if you like this video, please indicate so below. If you haven't already subscribed to Digging for Scriptural Gems on YouTube, please go there and do that. But above all, as always, I ask you each time to keep on studying or start studying God's Word on your very own. God bless you.